Well, I hope I'll start just looking at these just to put things in context. So the picture on the top left is a really dry field last year, and in fact we're seeing ever more extreme weather. This April was the frostiest and the coldest on record, which causes real difficulties for farmers. So we're really at the forefront of climate change. We've also had widespread flooding. We also need to think about food security, accessibility to food as well. So obviously we saw the bare shelves at the start of the first lockdown. Just shows how fragile this all is, and any discussion about food and farming needs to take this into account as well. I also want to touch on food waste as well, because I think the theme of waste is really important throughout this. Obviously, farmers have a role to play as well in terms of minimising waste. Everyone in the food system does, and that's something I'll touch on throughout the talk. What about greenhouse gases then? Well, in the UK, agriculture accounts for about 10% of our emissions. So you often hear the claim made that agriculture, well, particularly livestock, account for more carbon emissions than transport. It's not really true. I know at a global level it's not true either. So it's been redacted by the Food and Agriculture Organization, and that was the result of some questionable methodology that was later withdrawn. But obviously farming does have a major role to play, still a big emitter, and the farming sector needs to play its part. So in terms of the breakdown, just over half of that is methane, mainly from ruminant livestock. Nitrous oxide is next, mainly fertilizer and also from livestock manure. So for crop producers, that's the majority of their carbon footprint by far. And then CO2 at 12%. So that's things like tractor fuel. Not actually that great. Generally, the farming sector is dominated by non-CO2 gases. Particularly relevant for this talk, though, is the fact that about 5.7% of our emissions are cattle and sheep. So perhaps not as great as people would have you believe, and not necessarily doesn't necessarily tie in with some of the media coverage we've seen. But there's still emissions there, but I'd say probably a lot less than most people imagine. What are farmers doing on this? Well, I just wanted to start with really the farming sector committed to net zero by 2040 back in 2019, and we very much see the farming sector as part of the solution. So unlike a lot of other sectors, which are based more around unlocking fossil fuels, farming also has the opportunity to take carbon up and store it in the soils, biosphere, and things like that as well. So it's very much part of the solution. You've got to really see it like a cycle. Greenhouse gases going out of the system and also coming back into the system. So it is quite unique. As a result, it has quite a big role to play in tackling climate change. We've put together our plan for how we see this happening, and we split it into 3 key pillars. So the first one's around productivity, and that's basically efficiency, so producing more with less, or as much as you can with as little as possible. So again, ties into reducing waste. The second one is around farmland carbon storage, so things like letting hedges grow out, trees grow more, storing carbon in soils. And the third one is around bioenergy. So I've talked about this in previous talks. I'm not going to touch on it too much, but I just wanted to remind people of it. So first things first then, meat and dairy production. Is it carbon intensive? Well, this graph would have you believe, and it, in many measures, yes, it is. Your greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of product, if we use CO2 equivalent, tend to be higher than a lot of other foods. But you've got to really drill down into this, and I think graphs like this can be quite misleading. So this is based on a meta-analysis. So the researchers surveyed, 119. Well, they use data from 119 different countries. So you've got all sorts of different systems in there. Some that are really quite damaging for the environment, and some that aren't. Now this puts greenhouse gas emissions from beef at about 60 kilos of CO2. But actually, in the UK, the real figure would be more like here. So considerably less. And remember, this is CO2 equivalent as well. It's not taking into account the carbon that's taken up by well-managed pasture, and the fact that these systems can offset the need for other carbon emissions. For example, if you're putting livestock manure on fields of crops, you're using less fertilizer, which has a carbon footprint. So it's quite a crude way of measuring it. And I think really, to get to the bottom of these issues, we need a bit more nuance. So that's that graph. You probably see it circulated. So following on from that, I really want to talk about the difference between local and global level. So this graph here, this is very much a global picture. Perhaps not that relevant if you're a consumer in the UK. You know, almost all the red meat we eat here will be from the UK or Ireland, or possibly some from New Zealand and Australia maybe, but certainly for beef, it's quite easy to tell where it's from most of the time. So it's really important we differentiate between the local and the global in these discussions. And this can be really well illustrated. We look at the footprints of beef. I showed you on the graph, the average footprint of beef globally is about 60 kilos of CO2. But in the UK, it's about 16.9. And for dairy beef, you know, we're looking at about 10.9 kilos of CO2 equivalent. So there's a massive difference there. And if you don't differentiate, it can tell a very different story. It's particularly the case in milk as well. So, you know, we're less than half of the emissions, global average emissions. And you see graphs like this produced by, this is from the BBC website actually, and the figure they've used is unrecognisable for the UK. So it's kind of frustrating for farmers and people involved in this sector who are producing what's arguably, oh, there's a typo there, apologies, what's arguably quite a sustainable product, and it's not necessarily reported as such. We also need to take into account the bigger picture as well. So is there land use change, for example? We're grazing cattle on a river meadow in Bedfordshire. Are we deforesting the Amazon rainforest? Probably not. So should those emissions be linked to that product? Probably not. What are we feeding the animals as well? You know, are they being fed lots of imported soya linked to deforestation? Depends. And what about the impact of byproducts as well? So I talked about the fact that crop farmers can use cattle manure to reduce their carbon footprint. In fact, all agricultural sectors tend to be interlinked in the UK. You know, you've got, even if you haven't got livestock in those fields, the chances are that perhaps they'll be getting cattle manure from a nearby farmer in exchange for straw, or vice versa. So you need to take into account the bigger picture there. And I also wanted to point out as well that in the case of milk, we don't really have the same data for beef, but for milk, methane emissions have fallen by about 25% since 1990. A lot of this is to do with falling cattle numbers, but also they've got more efficient and just better at producing milk as well. So we wouldn't necessarily get that if you're using global figures. It also comes down to how we measure emissions as well. So the previous figures I've quoted were on CO2 equivalent, which doesn't really take into account the longevity of methane in the atmosphere. In fact, a team of researchers at Oxford University have come up with a new metric called GWP star, which they feel more accurately represents how methane behaves in the atmosphere and properly quantifies the actual warming impact it has, rather than just looking at CO2 equivalent emissions. And in fact, they estimate that over 30 years, if we were to cut methane emissions by 10%, because of the additional radiative forcing impact that it has, so the greater impact on the climate, we need to cut methane emissions by just 10% over 30 years. So bear in mind that we've cut methane emissions by 25% in the dairy sector since 1990, and effectively you'd have zero additional warming. If you were to cut them by 25%, so not inconceivable based on previous track record, you actually introduce serious or significant cooling effect. So again, really comes down to what metric you use to measure the impact. From the farming point of view, given that our sector is dominated by non-CO2 gases, it would make sense to use something like this. We've been quite vocal in lobbying for it alongside other farming organisations. And bodies like the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, sorry, they've acknowledged the limitations, but obviously for other sectors of the economy that are dominated by CO2, it's less of a priority. So it's quite challenging, and that's really not about getting farmers off the hook, but it's just about ensuring fair measurement and fair comparison. So I mentioned the fact that agriculture is part of a cycle, and I quite like this infographic. You've got to take it with a pinch of salt a little bit, but it really shows when we talk about livestock, you've got that cyclical nature that you need to think about. So obviously, ruminants will emit methane, for example, but that will then break down in the atmosphere and be taken up. If you're grazing on grass and that regrows, you're not really adding new carbon into the atmosphere in the same way as you would if you were burning fossil fuels, for example. So there needs to be that differentiation there. And obviously it has a warming impact, but if you're cycling existing carbon, arguably it's quite different to burning fossil fuels. We talked a bit about how soils can take up carbon. Well, there are kind of two ways that they do that. So the first one is through feeding soil microbes through root exudates, and also building up biomass in the soil through roots, which then die off and leave organic matter into the soil, raising its carbon content. So it's quite a powerful means of taking up carbon if done right. Just following on methane as well, I thought this was quite a nice infographic, just illustrating the cyclical nature. So yeah, we do have emitters of methane as well, but we also have quite a significant sink in terms of the biosphere, which I showed in that previous graph and previous infographic there. So it's a two-way cycle, and often isn't really discussed like this. Also worth thinking about other sources as well. So again, this is not to try and sort of get farmers off the hook, but just to illustrate that there are massive methane sources from rice paddies, for example, and also increasingly people are increasingly aware of the impact of oil and gas extraction and the huge methane leaks that it produces. So again, this in the oil and gas sector is unlocking new carbon that wasn't previously in the atmosphere. So possibly you can make the case that it should be but worth thinking about when we're talking about methane. We also need to think about nutrient density as well, because obviously we measure the carbon footprint of per kilo of product. It doesn't necessarily tell the true story. And for me, I think this can be really well illustrated in the dairy sector. So obviously a litre of UK cow's milk will give you a greater carbon footprint than a litre of oat milk. But if you take into account the protein content, you have to drink way more of the oat milk to get the same amount of protein. So you can make the case that actually the oat milk has a higher footprint in that instance. And I think that's quite significant, because it's all very well pointing to what people would say would be a lower impact product. But if you're not going to get the same nutrient content, then what are you really achieving there? I think there are concerns about just sort of blanket fixation on shifting to a plant-based diet without necessarily seeing the bigger picture and looking at nutrient content and the footprint per nutrient content. I put this infographic in the bottom here because I think that's really important to raise. The fact that in terms of diets in the UK, most cows would be grazed on forage-based systems. So effectively they're turning grass that humans can't eat into what's arguably a nutrient-dense product. So that's quite important to bear in mind as well. The food versus feed debate is something that comes up quite a lot, and often it's implied that livestock are somehow competing for growing space for food from humans. It's not really the case in the UK. Like I mentioned, your average cow, the bulk of the diet would come from grass. If they are eating grain, generally that's not going to be suitable for human consumption. So effectively, they're making use of a waste product. It's going to be there anyway. If you're a farmer and you don't make milling spec or human grade with your crops, where are you going to send it? Well, livestock give you an avenue, and you can still produce a food from that crop. And we also make quite widespread use of byproducts for livestock feed as well. So things like rapeseed meal. So when the byproducts of producing rapeseed oil, which is potentially an alternative to things like palm oil, spent brewers' grains, things like that. They'll all go into livestock diet. So often when you see statistics about the quantity of crops that are fed to animals, for example, they're perhaps a little bit misleading, because they'll take into account things like that. They're actually waste products. I'll talk a little bit about soya in a second, because that's quite an interesting one. But it's also worth making the point that in the UK, 65% of our farmland is grassland. And most of the time, this is because it's only really suitable for growing grass. It's either too dry, too wet, too hilly, or whatever it might be to grow crops successfully. So livestock allow us to produce food from areas that we otherwise wouldn't really be able to get a crop from. So again, it's not just as simple as turning all this land over to grow human grade crops, because if we were to do that, we wouldn't suddenly overnight start producing way more milling wheat, way more pulses, because it's challenging enough to produce human grade crops in the UK. We've got a number of companies that I like to point out Hodmer does, because they're pretty much the only people doing this, but they've made a concerted effort to get more British produce, and British pulses, sorry, into people's homes, which I think is fantastic. But it's really, really challenging. And Hovis illustrated this nicely when they made a commitment to only buy British milling wheat. Unfortunately, they had to drop it because it was just too difficult. So the point I really want to make here is that the land use in the UK is determined partly by economics, but also by environmental constraints as well. And we're not just suddenly going to start producing loads of human grade crops where we're not growing them already. And I think perhaps that's not necessarily always understood. So what about soya then? That always tends to get brought up. Well, it's quite an interesting one. And clearly, I'm not going to make the case for chopping down the Amazon rainforest to produce livestock feed. That's obviously not sustainable. So there needs to be a shift to sustainable soy, which is arguably happening. We're seeing some really big companies committing to 100% sustainably sourced soya. Obviously, that still has its issues. So I think there's also, alongside that, there's a real move to reduce and eventually get rid of soya in livestock feed. So it's worth pointing out, generally, we're talking about soya being fed to cows. We mean soya meal being fed to dairy cows. So beef animals generally wouldn't really have any soya. And when we do feed soya to cows, that takes the form of soya meal. So it's crushed soybeans. So again, it's a waste product. The soybeans are crushed to produce soya oil, which is the second most widely traded vegetable oil in the world. So again, it's not quite as simple as perhaps it's made to be. And it's a bit of a chicken and the egg scenario. In fact, by value, obviously, soya oil is more valuable than the meal. You could make the case that that's almost facilitating the production of soya to an extent. And Sustainable Food Trust did some really interesting research about the destination of this soya, and actually found that in terms of tonnage, the soya being brought into the UK was actually more of it was used in human food products and non-food products, as things like cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, then was actually fed to livestock, which is quite interesting. I mentioned about soy meal. Well, by far the biggest quantity that we're bringing in is soy meal. So that, again, that's a waste product, a byproduct. We are starting to grow soya in the UK, and there are a few people, well, not people, there's an increasing number of farmers looking at it, but it's a really, really tricky crop to grow. And there is a risk involved. Potential alternative to soya meal when cows are concerned is rape meal, which is people are doing exciting trials on that, potentially displacing soya in cattle diets with another waste product which we do produce in the UK without the associated environmental risks. So it'd be wrong to not mention soil health here. Now, I've kind of talked about how crop production and livestock production are intrinsically interlinked. Well, without wanting to paint too negative a picture of crop production in the UK, I think a lot of farmers are aware that their soils perhaps aren't as healthy as they should be. And Rothamsted did some work to quantify this, and estimate around 40% of arable soils are degraded. So that has serious implications for future crop production and the ability to do that sustainably. This is where livestock come in. There are a whole manner of benefits that well-managed livestock in a crop rotation can bring as well. A lot of farmers, this is John Pawsey over in Suffolk, who is an organic farmer who reintroduced sheep into his crop rotation with great success. He's an organic farmer, so he hasn't got the chemical inputs. He makes great use of sheep as an alternative to control weeds and to bring organic matter back into the soil. And these are sheep here grazing on, I think, which looks like a cover crop. So there will be adding organic matter into the soil. So again, helping lock up carbon, helping control weeds and pests as well. So again, it provides a non-chemical way of doing this. So really, really essential part of future cropping systems. And more farmers in this part of the world, even in Bedfordshire, we've got several people who are making real use of this and bringing livestock back into their crop rotations as part of their efforts to grow crops more sustainably. So the two are really intrinsically interlinked, and it's frustrating when you hear people talking about animal agriculture as if it's some kind of separate entity, because increasingly it's really not. We also need to think about the byproducts we get from livestock as well. So it's not just meat and milk. Remember, there are a huge number of products that you perhaps might not realise that also come from animals. So if we were to get rid of livestock, we would have to find these from other sources. And again, what's the environmental impact of that? What would happen in terms of demand for other goods, other commodities, and what would the environmental impact be of that? And I think there is huge potential, certainly something in the NFU we're keen to promote, opportunities for people to make use of wool as a sustainable building material. So whether that's in insulation or other building materials, it's got incredible thermal properties. And when sheep are grazing on grass, to produce the wool, they are taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So this is exactly the same as using wood or something like that. You know, it's a means of carbon storage, and it's got huge potential. Now, we all know we need to be safeguarding peat, and there are some fantastic farmers in the north of England who have developed a wool compost, because it's very nutrient rich, as an alternative to peat as well. Down in Cornwall, the council are making use of cattle manure to generate liquefied natural gas to power their fleet of lorries as a means of our carbon neutral fuel. Which has got huge potential across the rest of the country. And let's also not forget the environmental impact that the cows have in terms of the biodiversity that they promote. I mean cows and sheep, so grazing livestock provide a really vital habitat for all kinds of invertebrates, and if used in the right way, can have a really positive impact on the habitat they're in. Again, there's something that's overlooked, and increasingly we're seeing farmers, we're seeing landowners, using cattle instead of mowing areas, and farmers incentivized to do things like this. So there we go. That was kind of a whistle stop tour. Can get quite heavy hitting at points. So I'll try to sort of stay away from too many figures. But the things I really want to get across is that farmers are committed to net zero by 2040, and hopefully, if you saw the talk on Tuesday, you've seen some of the things they're doing. And it's also really important we don't export the footprint, simply export the footprint of our production overseas. So it's all very well changing diets, changing food production in the UK, but if we're simply going to import more produce with poor environmental credentials instead, it doesn't really achieve anything. We also need to make sure we distinguish between the local and the global, as I hopefully have explained. And as consumers in the UK, if we're buying British produce, our impact will be different to if we were buying produce in another country, and that needs to be thought about more. There are also a lot of direct and indirect impacts of food and farming that often aren't taken into account. So we kind of need to see the bigger picture here and look further along the food chain than perhaps is often done. I think this sums it up really well. You can apply this to lots of farming systems, livestock. It's not the cow, but it's how it's managed, the situation, and that determines the environmental impact. And that's something that's really important. For me then, in terms of what a sustainable diet is, well, I'm really quite open-minded. I've got no problem with what people want to eat. But for me, I think it really needs to be seasonal. The focus on a balanced diet, so a healthy diet, and as much British produce as possible. So hopefully that will lead to some questions and discussion, and I'll finish there.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So we've had quite a few questions. So this is from Dan. Dan asks, do the CO2 equivalent emissions shown earlier include fertilizer and herbicides? which are oil products, and how significant a portion do these represent?
Yeah, they should. So I guess you're talking about the sort of big graph. I mean, yeah, this is this would be farm to farm gate, if you like. So yeah, all the production emissions would be in there. So when we're talking about we're talking about the graph with all the different CO2 emissions on. Yeah, I imagine that would have the fertilizer and the sprays and things. You know, certainly if I was doing a footprint in a previous role, you take into account all those inputs as well. So I guess what they wouldn't take into account though would be the carbon sequestration. So the fact that, like I said, that well-managed pasture can mop up some of the carbon footprint of grazing livestock. But yeah, no, it is. It's you know, for crop production, fertilizer and sprays are a big chunk of your footprint, and anything you can do as a crop producer to reduce that if you're using livestock would be beneficial.
The next one is from Sarah. Sarah asks, why are our CO2 levels lower in the UK than other areas? What accounts for the main differences?
Well, so in the UK, our farming systems for livestock. So I'm talking about, you know, cows and sheep here. I really don't know too much about poultry and pigs, but obviously the UK is very well suited to producing grass without much in the way of the need of inputs. You know, you look out the window, a lot of the countryside, grass grows really readily. So farmers are able to make optimum use of this. I think also there's high animal welfare, animal health levels in the UK as well. So there's been a concerted effort over the last few years, and that's contributed a lot. But I think it's really that sort of that there is a natural advantage in terms of the climate here. So a lot of the land is well suited, not well suited to growing crops, but to grazing livestock. And you know, those figures will take into account farms from all around the world. So you know, you'll have you know, a dairy herd in India that's got 3 cows, you know, and their production would be really inefficient compared to the UK. So those are sort of, there are a lot of things at play there, but a lot of it comes down to diet, animal health, and just a real focus from the sector as well in terms of reducing that footprint that you might not have in other countries. You know, we're talking about developed countries here. So yeah, it is interesting though.
So a few more from Dan. Dan, do you want to unmute to help break down the questions, perhaps?
If I can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, that's fine. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, crack on.
I can no longer see my questions. Let me just hang on, fine, I can switch back to the chat. Right, so I was asking about the lower CO2 equivalent figures for UK beef. I think it was like the 10 kilos per kilo of beef, which still seems quite a lot of carbon, but compared to 60 kilos of CO2 equivalent overseas. But I was querying whether that accounts for the opportunity cost of the land that's given over to pasture currently. Because if that wasn't used for grazing, then large portions of it could instead be forested or reforested, and therefore offset significant emissions elsewhere, as well as restoring biodiversity. If you weren't growing cows on it, you just return to forest, temperate rainforest. One of my later questions is the same sort of thing, but you do make the point that some of the land that's currently given over to livestock farming isn't suitable for mechanized arable because it's too steep or it's too dry or whatever. But I don't think we would need all of that land if we weren't growing cows on it to eat, because that seems a very inefficient way of getting calories and proteins. I think if we did move to a plant-based diet, we would need much less land, and the land, the poorer quality farmland, for whatever reason, climate, dryness being too steep, could just be rewilded, is my question.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, it's a good point, isn't it? It's something that comes up quite often. A lot of farmers now are aiming to integrate the two. So I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of planting trees on farms and managing hedgerows and soils and things. So you're still having that carbon benefit. But no, those figures they're not based on carbon opportunity cost. It's a difficult one, right? Because the farmland in the UK there'll be a lot of farmers who are growing crops, and 1 year in 4 they might get might get crops that make human grade, but for the other years, they won't make the threshold necessarily. So where's that going to go? And I'd make the case that it's far better that we make use of that crop rather than it going to waste. So you do need livestock there as an outlet for what is a waste product. But no, certainly, there is a real role for farmers to play in managing when they do have livestock, in maximising the carbon storage potential there. So people are experimenting with things like agroforestry, so integrating forestry and farming in the same place. But I think it also comes down to the fact that we're not, like I said, we're not just suddenly going to start producing way more human grade crops in the UK. There's a lot, there is stuff we can do in the supply chain in terms of, perhaps more flexibility, more commitment to UK sourcing that could drive that up. But there's going to be that set amount of milling wheat and human grade pulses or whatever it is, when suddenly you're not just going to start producing more. So that would mean if we're displacing the livestock in the UK, we'd be importing a larger chunk of what we're eating from overseas. So yeah, I do get your point, Dan. I think it's it is a fair one, and there are areas of land we will probably see going out of production, and the new environmental schemes coming in. The top tier of that, it's undoubtedly we'll see land that doesn't go back into farming. It will effectively be rewilded. So yeah, it's all about balance. I don't think we should be aiming to import any more of the food that we eat, it's difficult enough as it is to grow human grade crops in the UK, especially as the climate gets more and more changeable. So I don't think we do to reduce the amount of food we grow in the UK. I think it is a risky business, if that makes sense.
Brilliant. Is there any more questions? Okay. This is from Beatrice. How easy is it for livestock farmers to practice the pasture-fed method of grazing? What percentage of livestock farmers in UK use this method approximately? How can we support the move to this?
Well, I guess it depends if you mean sort of 100% pasture for life. So there is a kind of a growing movement of producers who certify themselves as pasture for life. But majority of cows in the UK would be raised on a pasture-based system. There's a lot of work being done to encourage farmers to make optimum use of this, because I think in a lot of cases it makes good business sense. But there are real commercial constraints on this. So demands higher up the supply chain dictate that farmers have to raise an animal in a certain way at a certain in a certain time frame, and that can be really, really challenging on a 100% pasture based system. So often the people who are doing pasture for life, well, pretty much all the time, in order to sort of be compensated for that, they'll sell direct to consumers, which doesn't necessarily suit every business. But yeah, there's a lot of work going into helping farmers to make optimal use of pasture and manage it really, really effectively. And we'll definitely see a lot more of that in the future, because that's going to be a really key part of getting to net zero. So different mindset perhaps for producers. It's not going to work necessarily for everyone unless you see real commitment. And don't forget that when cattle are eating grain, that's not stuff that's really going to be suitable for human consumption. So it's not automatically a terrible thing. We talk about feedlots in the States. Yeah, that's probably not great. But we still need to have those avenues open to make use of those waste products.
We do have another one. This is from Judy. What do you think about the research used to use kelp for cattle feed, which apparently reduces the methane emissions of cattle significantly?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I've seen studies that point to almost a 96% reduction in methane emissions in some cases, which, you know, that's a real game changer. I guess the worry is, like anything, you know, we suddenly see massive demand for kelp, and we're going to see people harvesting seaweed on a huge scale and things like that. So I guess if you can synthesize that compound without the need to, you know, to harvest lots of seaweed, because that can have its own environmental impacts, and you can sort of create more problems there. But yeah, definitely, I think, you know, the farming sector is looking at feed additives, not necessarily feed additives, but optimizing diet for sort of maximum production and minimum methane production. So it's definitely a really interesting area. Cool.
Does anyone have any more questions?
Hang on, Sarah's just said we missed her question above. That would have said, oh. Shall I read that out?
Sorry, Sarah, I didn't realise that was a question. Okay, Sarah says, in your opinion, how do we manage, not the cow, the how, organic farming goes some way towards more sustainable livestock practices, such as some of those you've mentioned. But from what I understand, it's riddled with cost and paperwork and isn't always as good as it sounds. If consumers have confidence in the positive practices of a farm, they may be more inclined to eat meat.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I think having, oh, yeah, I mean, organic is I guess by organic, do you mean sort of pasture-based diets? You know, I guess there'll be a lot of farmers who are doing this stuff but aren't certified organic, you know, and those 100% pasture for life farmers won't be certified organic. And, you know, I can think of several people who are not marketing their produce as organic, but they are basically following organic principles. I'm not really sure how to answer that. I guess accountability and traceability are really important, and one of the reasons, you know, I make the case for people eating as much British produce as possible is based on my experience as a consultant in, you know, further up the food chain. The closer to home you are, the easier it is to manage all these things. And when you have produce coming in from all around the world, it gets really tricky to manage the footprint of that. So you know, there's a real case there for buying closer to home. I mean, I think, you know, your average UK farmer, you know, regardless of whether they're embarking on this sort of you know, serious regenerative process, will have, you know, really good carbon footprint compared to their counterparts in most other countries. So you know, I think it's important for farmers to tell their story and explain what they're doing, you know, and that's why we have this sort of accreditation and certification. You know, I'm very wary of sort of, you know, reducing it to organic versus conventional, because you know, that's quite a controversial debate within the farming sector, and I don't think it's necessarily a byword for automatic sustainability. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit, but it's yeah, it's a tricky issue.
We've got another one from Dan. How soon do you think synthetic engineered meat will be commercially viable?
Oh yeah, I don't know. I mean, I saw something about it being for sale in Singapore, but you know, from what I can understand, the carbon footprint, because of the inputs needed to produce it, doesn't necessarily stack up. You know, and I definitely make the case that, you know, you're better off buying traceable, transparent British produce, because you still need inputs to raise that meat. So yeah, we'll you know, we'll watch that with interest. But I think I'd go for British meat.
Does anyone have any more questions before we wrap up? Brilliant. Let me just share this. So a big thank you to those who have come tonight. As you may know, this is part of Bedford Sustainability Week, where we've got 11 events taking place throughout the week until Sunday. So on Saturday, we've got 2 talks. One is on home composting, a basic introduction, and then also after that will be one about the climate crisis and some solutions. And the registration for that closes tomorrow at 11:59 p.m. The last talk will be on Sunday, food waste prevention. That is with Natalie Pearson. You can book in 2 ways. You can head to Eventbrite and search for Sustainable Bedford, or even the event title you're looking for, or you can head to our social media. Instagram will have a link in our bio. And if you've got any questions or feedback, then do email me, sustainablebedford@gmail.com. Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks for joining.
Take care, everyone.